They found 6 shell casings on the marble floor and a wine bottle shattered across table 7. The Carabinieri report called it a failed assassination, a power struggle between rival families. But the staff at Terrazza del Sole knew better. They knew that on a sun-drenched afternoon in Rome, Filippo Santorini, the most respected man across Europe, sat down to what should have been his last meal. 6 armed men against 1. He should have been dead before his carbonara went cold. He wasn't. And it wasn't because of his bodyguards, or his influence, or his ruthlessness. It was because of the woman refilling his water glass. This is a tale of how a waitress dismantled the European underworld with a snap of her fingers. Filippo Santorini didn't look at menus anymore. From when you owned half the restaurants in Rome and the other half paid you protection, you simply told the chef what mood you were in. Today, he was in a carbonara mood, the kind made with guanciale so crisp it shattered between your teeth, with eggs from a farm in Umbria that knew better than to sell to anyone else first. He sat alone at the corner table of Terrazza del Sole, the one with sight lines to every entrance, though he hadn't bothered to actually watch them in years. His security detail, 4 men he'd personally selected from the Calabrian pipeline, were stationed at strategic points throughout the bistro. 1 by the kitchen doors, 1 near the restrooms, 2 covering the courtyard entrance. They wore suits that cost more than most Romans made in a month, and shoulder holsters that suggested they were worth every euro. While Filippo adjusted his cufflinks, 18-karat gold with tiny onyx inlays, and checked his phone. 3 messages from his accountant in Zurich, 2 from his shipping coordinator in Marseille, 1 from his son, Luca, asking about dinner next week. He ignored them all. When you controlled the Black Ledger, the shadow banking system that moved dirty money for everyone from oligarchs to oil cartels, people waited for you, not the other way around. The carbonara arrived on bone china so white it hurt to look at. Steam rose in delicate spirals. Filippo picked up his fork, twirled a perfect bite, and had just brought it to his lips when he noticed the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a high-end establishment, the wrong kind, the kind that preceded screaming. The kitchen door swung open. Marco, the butcher. Vadala walked out first. And Filippo's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Marco had been his lieutenant for 8 years, a vicious enforcer who'd once beaten a man to death with a phone book because it didn't leave marks. He was built like a bull, with a scar that split his left eyebrow in 2, and he was pointing a beretta directly at Filippo's forehead. 5 more men emerged behind him, 2 from the restrooms, 3 more from the kitchen. They fanned out in a practiced formation, creating a perimeter of gun barrels around Filippo's table. Each wore the same dark suits, the same dead expressions. Professional hitters, the kind you hired when you wanted a job done clean. Filippo set his fork down slowly. His hand didn't shake. 23 years as capo dei capi had taught him that fear was a currency, and he would never spend it in public. "Marco," he said, his voice carrying the same casual tone he'd used to order wine. "I assume you have an excellent reason for interrupting my lunch." Marco's gun didn't waver. "You've gotten soft, Filippo. Comfortable. You forgot the first rule." "Which is? Trust no one?" Filippo let his eyes drift to where his security detail should have been. The man by the kitchen doors was slumped against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his cream-colored shirt. The one near the restrooms had his face pressed into a potted ficus, neck bent at an angle that nature never intended. He couldn't see the 2 at the courtyard entrance, but he could guess their condition from the complete absence of movement. His pulse quickened, just slightly. Not panic. Calculation. He was 1 man in a room with 6 guns, all pointed at his center mass from less than 5 meters away. Even if he'd been carrying, which he hadn't bothered with in 3 years, the math didn't work. "This is about the Napoli territory," Filippo said, buying time. Or the Albanian supply route. We can negotiate, Marco. You know I'm reasonable." Marco laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "This isn't a negotiation, capo. This is a retirement party, and you're the guest of honor." The other 5 assassins tightened their grips. Fingers moved to triggers. Filippo could see their breath control, the way professionals steadied themselves before a kill shot. 30 seconds, maybe less. He glanced at the courtyard entrance. Too far. The kitchen. Suicide. The table. Flimsy decorative wood. Wouldn't stop a .22, much less what they were carrying. He was going to die eating carbonara at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and that offended him more than the betrayal itself. Then he noticed her. The waitress. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a simple black apron over a gray t-shirt. She was walking directly toward the table carrying a bottle of wine, completely ignoring the 6 armed men creating a firing squad formation around her. "Signora, you need to leave," Marco barked. "Now!" She didn't even look at him. She kept walking, her expression somewhere between bored and amused, like she'd seen this exact scene 100 times and found it tedious. She reached Filippo's table, set the wine bottle down with deliberate care, and made eye contact with Marco for the first time. Then she smiled, and snapped her fingers. The snap echoed in the courtyard like a gunshot that hadn't happened yet. For exactly half a second, nothing moved. Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, his face contorting with confusion and rage at this idiot waitress who just signed her own death warrant. The 5 other gunmen remained locked on Filippo, professional enough not to be distracted by a woman with a wine bottle and a death wish. Then, table 4 exploded into motion. The elderly couple, tourists, everyone had assumed, with their matching sun visors and fanny packs and guidebook to Roman churches, moved with a speed that defied their supposed age. The woman's hand came up from beneath the tablecloth, holding a matte black pistol, with a suppressor the length of a wine bottle. The man was already rolling left, so drawing from an ankle holster disguised as orthopedic socks. The first shot was a whisper, a pneumatic hiss that barely registered over the ambient noise of silverware and distant traffic. The gunman closest to the restrooms, a young Sicilian with slicked back hair, took the round through his temple and dropped like someone had cut his power cord. His Beretta clattered against marble, unfired. Marco's head snapped toward the sound, his tactical brain finally catching up to the reality that he'd walked into a counter-ambush. He started to pivot, started to bring his gun around toward the elderly woman, who absolutely was not elderly. But he was already 2 seconds behind the action, and in this business, 2 seconds was a lifetime. The tourist at the bar, a backpacker type with a Canon camera around his neck and a Rolling Stones t-shirt, had somehow materialized behind Marco's 2 kitchen door gunmen. His camera was on the floor. In his hands was something compact and German, an MP5K with integrated suppressor. He fired in controlled 3-round bursts, the kind of discipline that came from military training, not street work. The first burst caught the gunman on the left in the spine. He arched backward, his shot going wild into the ceiling, plaster dust raining down like snow. The second burst took the man on the right through the ribs before he could even process that his partner was down. Both crumpled in a heap, their weapons skittering across the polished floor. Marco was screaming now, something incomprehensible and primal, swinging his Beretta between multiple targets and finding himself too slow for all of them. He made the worst possible choice, tried to complete his original mission, pivoted back toward Filippo, and that hesitation killed his last 2 men. A waiter carrying a tray of antipasti near the kitchen had dropped his act entirely. The tray hit the ground with a crash of ceramic and olives, and in his hands was a Glock 19 that he fired with the casual competence of someone who did this for a living. 2 shots, center mass, into the gunman covering Filippo's right flank. The man went down, clutching his chest, blood spreading between his fingers like spilled wine. The final assassin, the one Marco had positioned near the courtyard entrance as rear security, realized he was the last one standing and made the intelligent choice to run. He turned and made it 3 steps toward the archway and walked directly into Sandra. She'd moved during the chaos, positioned herself in his escape route with the same wine bottle still in her hand. As he raised his pistol, she swung the bottle in a tight arc, catching him across the forearm with enough force to shatter bone and glass simultaneously. His gun fell. She followed up with her knee, driving it into his solar plexus, then grabbed his head with both hands and slammed it down onto her rising knee. His nose exploded in a spray of red. He dropped like a sack of concrete. The entire engagement had taken 7 seconds. Marco stood alone now, his Beretta shaking in his hand, surrounded by the bodies of his team and the very much alive operatives who'd been pretending to enjoy the bistro ambiance. The elderly woman had her pistol trained on his chest. The tourist had his MP5K locked on his head. The fake waiter was approaching from behind, weapon raised. Sandra stepped over the unconscious assassin at her feet, brushing broken glass from her apron like it was powdered sugar from a pastry. She walked directly up to Marco, stopping close enough that his gun barrel pressed against her sternum. "You should have left when I suggested it," she said quietly. Marco's eyes were wild, trapped animal desperation. "Who the fuck are you?" Sandra reached out, almost gently, and pushed his gun barrel aside. He let her. He was already a dead man, and somewhere in his lizard brain, he understood that. "Table service," she said. Then she looked past him to Filippo, who sat frozen with his fork still in hand, carbonara growing cold, while his entire understanding of reality undergoing rapid reconstruction. "Mr. Santorini," Sandra said, her tone shifting to something businesslike and urgent. "If you want to live through the next hour, you need to leave the pasta and come with me. Right now." The elderly woman fired once. Marco's body hit the floor beside the others. Sandra was already moving toward the kitchen. "I said now." Filippo's body moved before his brain finished processing. 23 years of survival instinct overrode his paralyzed shock, and he found himself on his feet, following the waitress who'd just orchestrated a massacre with a snap of her fingers. Sandra hit the kitchen doors at full speed, Filippo 2 steps behind. The kitchen staff had already evacuated, smart people who recognized the sound of suppressed gunfire and knew better than to be witnesses. Stainless steel prep stations gleamed under halogen lights. A pot of marinara bubbled unattended on the stove. Steam rose from an industrial dishwasher mid-cycle. "Through the loading bay," Sandra said, not breaking stride. She vaulted over a cutting station with practiced ease, landing in a crouch on the other side. Filippo followed more carefully, his €1,000 shoes slipping slightly on the grease-filmed floor. They were 3 meters from the loading bay door when it exploded inward. 2 more gunmen burst through, both carrying tactical shotguns, both wearing the same dark suits as Marco's team. Backup that had been staged outside, waiting for the all-clear signal that would never come. Sandra dropped and rolled left as the first shotgun roared, buckshot shredding the space where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. She came up beside an industrial mixer, grabbed a cast-iron pan from a wall hook, and hurled it like a frisbee. It caught the first gunman across the face with a wet crunch. He staggered backward, blood sheeting from his broken nose. Filippo wasn't carrying a weapon, hadn't needed one in 3 years. But the kitchen provided options for a man who'd built an empire on violence. He grabbed a chef's knife from a magnetic strip, 30 centimeters of carbon steel, balanced for precision work, and threw it underhanded at the second gunman as he swung his shotgun toward Sandra. The knife wasn't designed for throwing. It tumbled through the air with all the aerodynamic grace of a falling brick. But at 3 meters, Precision mattered less than commitment, and Filippo had always committed fully. The blade caught the gunman in the shoulder, not deep, barely a flesh wound, but enough to make him flinch, to pull his shot wide. The buckshot took out a hanging rack of copper pots instead of Sandra's spine. She was already moving, closing the distance before he could chamber another round. She drove her palm up into his chin, snapping his head back, then swept his legs. He went down hard. She stomped on his wrist. The sound of small bones breaking was surprisingly loud, and kicked the shotgun away. The first gunman was back up, blood-blind and enraged, swinging his shotgun like a club. Sandra ducked under the wild arc and drove her fist into his solar plexus. Air exploded from his lungs. She followed with an elbow to his temple, and he joined his partner on the floor, unconscious. "You throw knives like a child," Sandra said, already heading for the loading bay. "I hit him, didn't I?" "You got lucky." The loading bay opened onto a narrow service alley, barely wide enough for a delivery truck. A white Fiat van sat idling, back doors open, the elderly couple from table 4 already climbing into the driver and passenger seats. The tourist with the MP5K was providing rear security, scanning the alley entrance with professional paranoia. "Van's going north to the safe house," Sandra said. "We're not." "Why the hell not?" She was already moving toward a battered red Vespa chained to a downspout. She produced a tension wrench and pick from somewhere in her apron. Filippo didn't see where, and had the chain open in 4 seconds. Because Marco wasn't an idiot. He'll have positioned spotters on the main routes. They'll be looking for a vehicle extraction. She swung her leg over the Vespa, kicked it to life. The engine sputtered, coughed, then settled into an asthmatic purr. "Get on." Filippo stared at the scooter like she'd suggested they escape on a unicycle. "I haven't ridden one of these since I was 16. "Then it's lucky I'm driving." "Get on." The crack of gunfire from inside the bistro made the decision for him. He climbed on behind her, his expensive suit jacket riding up awkwardly, his arms wrapping around a waitress's waist, in a position that would have been undignified an hour ago and was now simply survival. Sandra twisted the throttle, and the Vespa lurched forward with all the raw power of an asthmatic hamster. They shot out of the alley onto Via dei Coronari, weaving between a tour bus and a gelato cart. Behind them, 2 black sedans screeched around the corner, engines roaring with considerably more horsepower than their tiny scooter could muster. "They're following us!" Filippo shouted over the wind. "I know!" Sandra banked, hard left, into an alley so narrow Filippo could touch the walls on both sides, cobblestones blurring beneath them at a speed that felt suicidal on 2 wheels. "Hold on." She wasn't asking. She was warning. The Vespa dove into Rome's ancient labyrinth, and behind them, the sedans tried to follow into spaces designed for donkeys, not modern vehicles. The sound of scraping metal and shouted curses echoed off medieval stone as Sandra threaded them through impossibly tight turns, past startled pedestrians, and under archways built before Columbus sailed. Filippo held on, his knuckles wide against her apron, and realized with absolute certainty that he had no idea who was saving his life or why, and that terrified him more than Marco's betrayal ever could. The antique shop sat wedged between a closed tobacconist and a shuttered leather goods store on a street that tourists walked past without seeing. The kind of Roman neighborhood where laundry hung from balconies and old men played cards in doorways, and nobody asked questions about the comings and goings of their neighbors. Sandra killed the Vespa's engine 2 blocks away and walked it the final distance, Filippo trailing behind, with his suit jacket torn at the shoulder and his €1,000 shoes scuffed beyond salvation. She knocked on the shop's steel-reinforced door in a pattern, 3 quick, 2 slow, 1 quick, and it opened before the echo faded. The inside smelled like dust and old wood, and something chemical that Filippo recognized from his years ordering cleanups. the scent of bleach trying to hide copper. The front room was claustrophobic with inventory. Baroque furniture stacked 3 high, oil paintings leaning against walls in rows, gilt mirrors reflecting their fractured images back at them through decades of tarnish. Sandra locked the door behind them, engaged 2 deadbolts and a chain, then moved through the shop with the familiarity of someone who'd been here before. She pushed aside a grandfather clock on hidden wheels, revealing a narrow door that led to a back room. The back room told a different story than the antique facade. LED strip lighting, 3 laptops on a stainless steel table, a weapons rack with enough firepower to stage a minor coup, a medical kit that looked like it came from a military field hospital, and a wall of monitors showing security camera feeds from 6 different angles of the surrounding streets. Filippo stood in the doorway, watching his own image on one of the monitors, a disheveled Mafia boss who'd aged 10 years in the last 30 minutes. His arm throbbed where a piece of buckshot had grazed him during the kitchen fight. Not deep, barely bleeding, but the adrenaline was wearing off and reality was starting to register pain. "Sit," Sandra said, pulling out a chair and gesturing to it like she owned the place, like she owned him. Something inside Filippo cracked. The fear converted to rage, because rage was safer, more familiar. He grabbed the chair and hurled it across the room. It hit the weapons rack with a crash of metal and clatter of falling firearms. "Who the fuck are you?" His voice was raw, stripped of the casual authority he'd worn for 2 decades. "Who do you work for? Why am I still alive?" Sandra didn't flinch. She walked calmly to the medical kit, removed what she needed, antiseptic, gauze, a suture kit, and set them on the table with methodical precision. "My name is Sandra Dannison," she said. "I'm a contractor, private sector crisis management. My team specializes in high-value asset extraction and protection. I didn't hire you. No. Someone who wants you alive did." She pointed at the chair he'd thrown. "Pick it up and sit down. That graze on your arm needs stitches before it gets infected. Answer my questions first." She looked at him, then really looked at him, and Filippo felt something cold slide down his spine. Her eyes were the color of slate, and they held the same empty assessment he'd seen in the faces of his best killers, the ones who could end a life and finish their espresso without breaking stride. "You're Filippo Santorini," she said quietly. "Capo dei capi of the European network. You control the Black Ledger, the shadow banking system that moves approximately 47 billion euros annually in illicit funds. You have operations in 19 countries. You own politicians, judges, police chiefs. You're untouchable." She paused. "Or you were, until your own lieutenant tried to execute you during lunch." Filippo said nothing. His jaw worked, grinding molars. "Someone hired us to keep you breathing," Sandra continued. "They didn't tell me why. They didn't need to. I don't ask why. I ask how much, and they paid enough." She gestured at the chair again. "Now, sit down before I make you." He wanted to laugh at that. Make him. This woman who probably weighed 60 kilos soaking wet, threatening a man who'd built his reputation on breaking bones and burying bodies. But he'd seen her move, seen her dismantle 6 armed men like she was clearing dishes, and he realized with a clarity that felt like vertigo that he was genuinely, physically afraid of her. He picked up the chair. He sat down. Sandra rolled up his sleeve with clinical efficiency, exposing the shallow furrow the buckshot had carved through his bicep. She cleaned it with antiseptic that burned like liquid fire, and he forced himself not to wince because that felt like surrendering something important. "This will hurt," she said, threading the curved needle. I've had worse." "I'm sure you have." She worked in silence, her hand steady, each stitch placed with surgical precision. Filippo watched her face, looking for something, emotion, hesitation, humanity, and found nothing but focused concentration. Like he was a broken appliance she was repairing, not a man who controlled more power than most governments. "How long have you been watching me?" he asked. 3 weeks. The waitress job was cover, obviously. And the others? The elderly couple? The tourist? My team, all contractors, all very good at their jobs. She tied off the final stitch, snipped the thread. "Which is why you're still alive." She wrapped his arm in clean gauze, her fingers brushing his skin, and Filippo felt the irrational urge to pull away. Not from pain, from proximity to something dangerous he didn't understand. "Marco wasn't working alone," Sandra said, stepping back. "That kind of operation requires planning, resources, inside information." She met his eyes. "Someone in your inner circle wanted you dead. Someone who knew your schedule, your security protocols, your favorite restaurants." Filippo's mind raced through the possibilities, sorting betrayers from the loyal, and came up with too many candidates. Sandra checked her watch. "We have maybe 2 hours before they realize the hit failed and come looking harder. You need to figure out who's behind this." She paused. "And then, you need to decide if you want revenge or if you want to survive. Because, Mr. Santorini, you can't have both. If you are still here, kindly subscribe to my channel and comment the time in your country." Sandra moved to the laptop array and began typing with the rapid-fire precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Her fingers danced across keys, windows cascading open on the screens, encrypted channels, communication protocols, frequency scanners cycling through bands like a radios, searching for signal. "Your organization uses a modified Tetra system for internal communications," she said without looking up. "Military-grade encryption, rotated frequencies, burner devices. Very professional." Her fingers never stopped moving. "Also completely compromised. We've had a backdoor into your network for 18 days. Filippo stood behind her, watching lines of code scroll past, feeling a fresh wave of violation wash over him. His empire, his fortress of security and paranoia and blood-bought loyalty, and had been transparent as glass to this woman and whoever employed her. If you've been listening for 18 days, you knew the hit was coming. We knew something was coming. Marco was sloppy with operational security once he decided to betray you. We picked up fragments, location, timeline, force composition. Not enough to stop it, but enough to position assets." She glanced back at him. "You're welcome, by the way." Before Filippo could respond, one of the monitors lit up with an active signal. Sandra isolated it, filtered out the background static, and suddenly the room filled with voices. His voices, his people, his family. "Confirm visual on the target, then extract immediately." Marco was explicit. "No witnesses, no complications." A different voice, younger, with the clipped accent of Northern Italy. "What about Marco himself? He's not responding to check-in protocols." "Probably celebratory grappa. You know how he gets after a wet job. Give him an hour, then." Sandra cut the feed, switched to another channel. This one was clearer, closer. A conference call in progress with at least 6 participants on the line. She enhanced the audio, and Filippo's world inverted. "Which means we proceed as planned." The voice was achingly familiar. Filippo's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles going white. "My father built an empire, but empires require evolution. The old methods, the old brutalities, they attract too much attention in the modern era. We need to be smarter, cleaner, more. Your father's not even cold yet, Luca." A different voice, gravelly, skeptical. Gino Torrisi, underboss of the Sicilian operations. Some of us remember when he personally. "My father is dead." Luca's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Marco confirmed the kill 2 hours ago. 6 shooters, close range, no possibility of survival. And yes, Gino, I understand your sentimentality. But sentiment doesn't move 47 billion euros through the black ledger. Vision does. Strategy does. And right now, I'm the only one in this family with both. Filippo couldn't breathe. The air had turned solid in his lungs, crushing him from the inside. His son, his only child. The boy he'd kept away from the worst of the business, sent to university in London, tried to give options beyond blood and violence. That boy was on a conference call discussing his corpse like it was a quarterly earnings report. The transition will be seamless, Luca continued. I've already contacted our partners in Marseille, Rotterdam, and Prague. They understand that continuity is paramount. The black ledger doesn't stop just because. Sandra muted the feed. The silence in the safe house was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of traffic beyond the reinforced walls. Filippo stood frozen, staring at the audio waveform patterns still pulsing across the monitor. His mind was running calculations it didn't want to run, connecting betrayals like constellation points. Marco hadn't acted alone. Marco wasn't smart enough to plan something this comprehensive. But Luca was. Luca, who'd studied economics and political theory. Luca, who'd always argued that the family business needed modernization. Luca, who knew every detail of Filippo's schedule because they had dinner together every Thursday. Filippo's voice came out wrong, cracked and hollow. I need a moment. No. Sandra's response was immediate, clinical. You need to focus. I know what your son just did. She stood, positioned herself between Filippo and the door, between him and whatever escape into grief or rage or collapse he was considering. And in approximately 90 minutes, when Marco's backup team reports that the body count at Terrazza del Sole doesn't include yours, your son is going to realize his coronation is premature. Then he's going to send everyone he has to finish the job. Filippo's legs felt unsteady. He groped for the chair, sat down heavily. 23 years of maintaining absolute control, of never showing weakness, of being the apex predator in every room. All of it collapsed into a single question that came out barely above a whisper. Why? Does it matter? He's my son. He's a man who tried to murder his father for a password and a database. Sandra's voice was sharp as a scalpel, cutting through his shock. You can grieve later. You can question what you did wrong as a parent later. Right now, you have one job: survive long enough to make him regret it. Filippo looked up at her, this woman who'd saved his life for money, who'd killed 6 men with a snap of her fingers, who stood in front of him now with all the mercy of a stone wall. I taught him everything, Filippo said. Business, strategy, leverage. I kept him away from the violence, but I taught him how empires work. Then you taught him too well. Sandra moved back to the laptop, began typing again. He's hosting something tonight, a gathering at the family estate. Your estate. She pulled up what looked like catering orders, security protocols, guest lists. 8 p.m., invitation only. The major players from your organization, plus representatives from partner families. A victory party. A consolidation of power. She turned to face him fully. He's going to announce his succession, receive pledges of loyalty, probably make a speech about your legacy. It's smart. He's moving fast before anyone has time to question the narrative. Filippo felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. Not grief, not shock. Something older, and something that had kept him alive through 2 decades of gang wars and power struggles and assassination attempts. The part of him that calculated odds and eliminated threats and understood that in his world, family was just another variable. The estate has biometric security, he said quietly. retinal scan to access the vault level, where the primary black ledger server banks are housed. Sandra's expression shifted, just slightly. Understanding. He can't access it without you, Filippo continued, which means he needs to believe I'm dead until he can find a workaround. But if I'm not dead, he stood, his arm throbbing where she'd stitched him, his entire body aching with exhaustion and betrayal and cold, calculating rage. If I'm not dead, then I'm a threat, the only threat that matters. So we go to the party, Sandra said. Ma Filippo met her eyes. We go to the party. The Santorini estate sat in the hills above Rome, like a Renaissance fortress that had learned to wear suits. 18th century stonework, manicured gardens, a circular driveway that could accommodate 20 limousines. Filippo had bought it 15 years ago from a count who'd gambled away his inheritance, and he'd filled it with art and antiques and the kind of security systems that made embassies jealous. Tonight, every window blazed with light. Valets in white gloves directed arriving vehicles. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns ascended the marble steps where Filippo had once greeted heads of state and cartel bosses with equal courtesy. His son was throwing a party in his dead father's house, and half of Europe's criminal elite had RSVP'd yes. And Sandra handed Filippo a pair of designer glasses with clear lenses and a subtle change to his facial structure. Prosthetic cheekbones that altered his profile just enough. His hair was slicked back differently, grayed at the temples with temporary color. The Brioni tuxedo they'd acquired from a rushed visit to a fence who specialized in high-end goods fit him perfectly because it had been tailored for someone exactly his size and tax bracket. You look like a German investment banker with a cocaine habit, Sandra said, studying him critically. Which is perfect. Half the guests tonight will fit that description. She'd transformed as well. The practical waitress had vanished, replaced by a woman in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than most Romans made in 6 months. Her hair was down, styled in waves that softened her features. Diamond earrings that were almost certainly fake caught the light. She looked like a mistress, the kind that powerful men brought to events when their wives stayed home. We're Dieter and Anastasia Volkov, she said, handing him a leather billfold with perfectly forged German identification. You're a private equity fund manager specializing in distressed assets. I'm your companion, who asks no questions about your business. And we're on the guest list because I'm very good at my job. She checked her compact, touched up lipstick that didn't need touching. Luca's assistant received a call 4 hours ago from someone claiming to be his father's contact in the Berlin underworld, a man who wanted to pay his respects to the new leadership. The assistant added Dieter Volkov to the list without hesitation. You impersonated Klaus Zimmermann. His voice, at least. The real Klaus is currently enjoying an unexpected vacation in his Berlin apartment, courtesy of my colleagues. He'll be released tomorrow with no memory of tonight and a splitting headache. A black Mercedes pulled up to the safe house exterior. The elderly couple from the bistro sat in the front seat, looking considerably younger now that they'd dropped the tourist disguise. The woman, Sandra had called her Rachel, gave a small nod. Our ride, Sandra said. Last chance to reconsider this monumentally stupid plan. Filippo adjusted his glasses, feeling the slight pressure of the prosthetics against his cheekbones. My son tried to kill me. I'm not reconsidering anything. The drive took 20 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Filippo watched Rome slide past the tinted windows. His city, his territory, streets he controlled through carefully maintained networks of fear and influence, and felt like a ghost visiting his own life. Dead, but not dead. Erased, but still present. Schrodinger's Mafia boss, simultaneously murdered and seeking revenge. They joined the queue of arriving vehicles. Avallo opened Sandra's door, then Filippo's. The marble steps were the same ones he'd climbed 10,000 times, but now each one felt like walking toward a ledge in the dark. The entrance hall was packed with bodies and conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Servers circulated with trays of Prosecco and small plates of things that cost too much. Filippo recognized faces everywhere: underbosses, smugglers, money launderers, politicians he'd purchased, judges he owned. The infrastructure of his empire, gathered to pledge fealty to his murderer. No one looked at him twice. He took champagne from a passing tray because his hands needed something to do other than form fists. Sandra stayed close, playing her role perfectly. Attentive, but not intrusive. Decorative, but not vapid. They drifted through the crowd like smoke, invisible through the sheer audacity of their presence. There. Sandra's voice was barely a murmur as she pretended to laugh at something he'd said. 10 o'clock. Your son. Luca stood near the grand staircase, surrounded by a constellation of admirers. He wore a tuxedo that Filippo recognized as one of his own, taken from his closet, worn like a trophy. 28 years old, and handsome in the way his mother had been, with Filippo's dark eyes and calculating expression. He was holding court, accepting congratulations with practiced humility, every inch the young prince ascending to his inherited throne. Filippo's hand tightened around the champagne flute hard enough that he feared it might shatter. "Breathe," Sandra whispered. "You're a German banker who's bored at a party, not a man planning fratricide." A hand clapped Filippo's shoulder, and his entire body went rigid. He turned to find Gino Torrisi, the Sicilian underboss, his face flushed with wine and sentiment. Dieter, was it? Gino's English was heavily accented. Terrible business about Filippo. Terrible. He was. Gino's eyes went distant, maudlin. He was a great man, a vision. His son, though, that Luca, he's sharp. Different style, but sharp. Indeed, Filippo said, pitching his voice slightly higher, adding a German precision to the consonants. Though I did not know the father, only his reputation. The father. Gino raised his glass. To Filippo Santorini, may he rest in pieces. The crowd around them laughed. Someone had made the same toast earlier, apparently. A joke that was already spreading through the party like a virus. Rest in pieces. Very clever. Very funny. Filippo smiled, touched his glass to Gino's, and drank to his own death, while his son accepted congratulations 20 meters away. Sandra's hand found his elbow, steadying. "The vault," she whispered. "We need to move soon." A bell chimed. The crowd quieted. Luca was ascending the grand staircase, positioning himself on the landing where he could address the assembled guests. The string quartet fell silent. Every face turned toward him, expectant. "Friends, colleagues, family," Luca began, his voice carrying perfectly through the marble hall. "Thank you for coming tonight to honor my father's memory and to witness the beginning of a new era for our organization." Filippo set his champagne down on a side table before he could throw it. "My father built something extraordinary," Luca continued, "but he was a man of the old ways. Violence, intimidation, the blunt instruments of a previous generation. Tonight I promise you something different, a more sophisticated approach, a more profitable future." The crowd murmured approval. These were men who preferred profit to principle, always had been. Sandra tugged his elbow. "Now, while everyone's distracted." They slipped toward the south corridor, so the one that led to the estate's lower levels, to the vault, where the black ledger servers hummed behind biometric locks. Behind them, Luca's voice echoed through the hall, promising transformation and prosperity and 100 other lies. Filippo walked toward his own vault to reclaim his kingdom from his son, and wondered distantly when exactly he'd lost the ability to recognize the monster he'd created. The south corridor was mercifully empty, the party noise fading to a distant murmur as they descended into the estate's lower levels. Filippo's footsteps echoed on marble stairs he'd walked countless times, leading down to the infrastructure that made his empire possible. Not the violence or the reputation or the fear, those were just theater. The real power lived in the servers 3 floors below ground. I'm behind reinforced concrete and biometric locks. Sandra moved ahead of him, her evening dress impractical for what they were about to do, but her stride still predatory, still calculating angles and sight lines from habit. She paused at each corner, checked her compact, which Filippo now realized had a small mirror angled to see around blind spots, then motioned him forward. "Security cameras?" he asked. "Looped. Rachel's handling the feed from the van. As far as your security team knows, this corridor has been empty all night." She glanced back at him. "How long to access the vault once we're inside?" "The retinal scan takes 3 seconds. The secondary biometric is a palm print, another 2 seconds. Then a 16-digit alphanumeric code that only I know." "How long to transfer the data?" "Depends what you're taking. The full Black Ledger archive is 6 terabytes. Complete transaction records, account holders, routing protocols, authentication keys for the entire network. With the compressed transfer protocol, maybe 20 minutes. Sandra stopped at a reinforced steel door, the kind that belonged in a bank or a military installation. The access panel beside it glowed with a soft blue light, waiting for credentials it would recognize. This was the threshold. Beyond it, the vault level. Beyond it, the heart of everything Filippo had built. 20 minutes is a lifetime when people are hunting you, Sandra said. Then you'll have to keep them busy. She smiled at that, the same predatory expression she'd worn when she snapped her fingers at Terrazza del Sole. I'm good at keeping people busy. Filippo placed his palm on the reader. Green light washed across his hand, reading the unique pattern of his skin. The door hissed, pneumatic seals releasing, and swung inward on silent hinges. The vault level was cold, climate-controlled to protect the servers that hummed in neat rows behind ballistic glass partitions. LED strips cast everything in antiseptic white light. The air smelled like ozone and recycled atmosphere. Filippo had designed this space himself, consulted with security experts and IT specialists and paranoid men who protected Russian oligarchs. It was a fortress inside a fortress, impregnable from the outside. The main terminal sat on a raised platform at the room's center, surrounded by 3 layers of biometric security. Filippo approached it, Sandra shadowing him, and positioned himself before the retinal scanner. A targeting reticle appeared, eye-tracking his eye movement. He held still, let the laser map the unique pattern of his iris, felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came from submitting to a machine's judgment. The scanner beeped. Green light. First layer cleared. He placed his palm on the reader. Another beep, another green confirmation. Second layer cleared. His fingers moved across the keypad, entering the 16-digit code he'd memorized years ago and never written down. Each keystroke felt like removing a brick from a wall, exposing what lay behind. The terminal screen flickered to life, displaying the Black Ledger's root directory. Thousands of files, millions of transactions, the complete architecture of Europe's shadow economy. We're in, Filippo said quietly. Sandra was already moving, pulling a portable drive from somewhere in her dress. She connected it to the terminal's USB port, began navigating the file structure with the efficiency of someone who'd been briefed on exactly what to extract. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, selecting directories, initiating transfers. The compressed protocol will take 17 minutes, she said, watching the progress bar. Can you? The vault door slammed shut. The sound was thunder in the enclosed space, reverberating off concrete walls. Filippo spun toward it, his hand instinctively going to his waistband, where a weapon should have been but wasn't, his mind racing through scenarios and finding none of them good. A figure stepped out from behind one of the server racks. Marco the Butcher. Vadala looked worse than death. The left side of his face was swollen, the eye nearly shut. His suit was stained with blood, some his, and some belonging to the men who died around him. He moved with a pronounced limp, favoring his right leg, but the Beretta in his hand was steady, and it was pointed directly at Filippo's chest. You know what really pisses me off? Marco's voice was thick, slurred slightly from the facial swelling. I took 4 rounds at that fucking bistro, 1 in the vest, thank Christ, but 3 more that actually hit meat. I spent the last 6 hours getting stitched up by a veterinarian in Trastevere because I couldn't go to a real hospital. Sandra's hand moved toward her thigh, where Filippo assumed she'd hidden a weapon under the evening dress. Marco's gun shifted to her immediately. Don't, he said. I'm already dying, lost too much blood. But I can still pull this trigger. And at this range, I don't need to be steady. He coughed, and something dark flecked his lips. So, here's what's going to happen. The waitress is going to remove whatever weapon she's reaching for and slide it across the floor. Then both of you are going to step away from the terminal. How did you get in here? Filippo demanded. This level requires your son's retinal scan and palm print. Marco smiled, and it was horrible to look at. Yeah, Filippo, about that. Luca's not just smart. He's patient. Been making contingency plans for months. He got his biometrics added to the vault access 6 weeks ago. Told you it was for security redundancy. You believed him because he's your son, and you're sentimental. The progress bar on the screen behind them showed 4% complete, 13 minutes remaining. Sandra hadn't moved. Her hand was still near her thigh, frozen in the moment before drawing a weapon. She was calculating odds. Filippo could see it in her posture. Distance to target, reaction time, probability of success. The math wasn't good. Marco, Filippo said carefully, you're right. You're dying. But you could still walk away. There's a clinic in Switzerland, discreet. They could... Shut up. Marco's gun hand trembled slightly. Adrenaline or blood loss or both. I don't want your money. I don't want your promises. I want what I was supposed to have 6 hours ago. He steadied his aim. I want to watch you die. The progress bar ticked to 5%. Sandra's eyes met Filippo's across the space between them, and in that look was a question neither of them wanted to answer. Was 17 minutes enough time to survive a dead man with nothing left to lose? Sandra moved first, not toward Marco, but sideways, putting herself between the gun and Filippo in a motion so fluid it looked choreographed. Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, but she was already dropping, her evening dress shredding as she slid across the polished floor toward the nearest server rack. The Beretta roared. The shot went high, punching through ballistic glass with a crack like breaking ice. Sparks cascaded from damaged electronics. Filippo dove behind the terminal platform as Sandra came up holding something she'd grabbed from beneath the server rack, a fire extinguisher, red and heavy, and designed for electrical fires. She hurled it with the same precision she'd shown with the cast iron pan at the bistro. It caught Marco in his wounded leg, and he went down hard, his second shot going wild into the ceiling. But Marco was a survivor of 2 decades in the murder business, and pain was just another language he spoke fluently. He rolled with the fall, came up on one knee, and fired twice more. Sandra was already moving, serpentine, using the server racks as cover. One round missed. The other grazed her shoulder, tearing fabric and skin, and Filippo saw her flinch but not stop. She grabbed a maintenance cart loaded with equipment, diagnostic tools, cable spools, a laptop for server access. She shoved it toward Marco with enough force to make the wheels scream. He tried to dodge, too slow with his injured leg, and the cart caught him in the ribs. His breath exploded out in a wet gasp. Sandra vaulted over the cart before he could recover, landing with her knee driving into his gun arm. Something cracked. Bone or tendon or both. The Beretta skittered across the floor. But Marco still had 40 pounds on her and nothing left to lose. His left hand came up, caught her by the throat, fingers digging into her windpipe, with the desperate strength of a dying man trying to take someone with him. They crashed backward into another server rack, the impact rattling equipment off shelves. Filippo saw the Beretta lying 5 meters away, saw the progress bar on his terminal screen showing 14%, saw Sandra's face going red as Marco's grip tightened. The choice was instant, instinctive. He ran for the gun. His fingers closed around the grip, just as Sandra drove her thumb into Marco's swollen eye socket. Marco screamed, his grip loosening just enough for Sandra to break free. She grabbed a cable spool from the floor, industrial copper wire, not 10 kilos at least, and swung it like a medieval mace. It connected with Marco's temple with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting concrete. Marco dropped. Not dead, his chest still rose and fell, but done, finished. Whatever adrenaline had kept him upright finally spent. The vault door hissed open. Luca stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men Filippo recognized as his personal security detail. His son had changed since the party. The tuxedo jacket was gone, shirt sleeves rolled up, and in his hand was a Sig Sauer that looked too comfortable in his grip. Behind him, the sound of the party continued upstairs, oblivious. "Father." Luca's voice was calm, almost curious. "You're significantly more difficult to kill than I anticipated." Filippo raised the Beretta, his hand steadier than he expected. "Luca, now we can—" "Don't." His son's gun came up smoothly, professionally. "Whatever you're about to say. That we can work this out. That I'm still your son. That family means something. Save it. I've run the numbers. You're a liability. An outdated operating system that can't be upgraded." Sandra had positioned herself near the terminal, her shoulder bleeding but her stance ready. The 2 security men behind Luca had their weapons drawn, but seemed uncertain. Hired muscle, not true believers, waiting for clear instructions. "The Black Ledger is mine now," Luca continued. "I have vault access. I have the loyalty of the key players. I have everything except—" His eyes moved to the terminal, to the progress bar showing 38%. "Except whatever you're downloading. So here's what happens. You disconnect that drive. I slide it across the floor, and I'll consider making your death painless." "You sound like you've been watching too many movies," Sandra said. Her voice was hoarse from Marco's choking, but steady. The dramatically evil son monologuing while his father holds a gun. How does this usually end? "In my experience," Luca smiled, "the son wins. Evolution is inevitable." Filippo felt something break inside him that had been cracking since he heard his son's voice on that intercepted call. Not his will, not his survival instinct. Something softer and more human. The part that had read bedtime stories and attended school plays and dreamed of giving his child a better life. That part died now, cleanly and completely. And what remained was the man who'd built an empire on calculated violence. "You're right," Filippo said quietly. "Family doesn't mean anything." He shot Marco in the head. The butcher's body jerked once and went still, and in the shocked half-second that followed, Luca's eyes widening, the security men flinching, Sandra moved. Her hand came up from her bleeding shoulder holding a compact pistol that she'd apparently had hidden the entire time, and she fired twice. Both rounds hit Luca's right leg, one through the thigh, one through the knee. He went down screaming, his Sig Sauer falling from nerveless fingers. The 2 security men raised their weapons, but Sandra's gun was already tracking to them. "You can die for a man who just proved he'll kill his own blood," she said conversationally, "or you can leave. Choose quickly." They chose to leave. Smart men. Well, the vault was suddenly quiet, except for Luca's sobbing breaths and the hum of servers and the soft beep of the terminal indicating 63% complete. Filippo walked over to his son, looked down at the young man clutching his shattered leg, and felt nothing at all. "You were right," Filippo said. "Evolution is inevitable." He crouched down, picked up Luca's Sig Sauer, checked the chamber. "But you forgot the most important rule I ever taught you." "What rule?" Luca gasped through pain. "Never try to kill someone unless you're absolutely certain they're dead." Filippo stood, tucked the cig into his waistband. "Now, you're going to lie there quietly while that drive finishes copying. Then, you're going to tell me every person who helped you plan this, every name, every detail. And maybe, I'll let you live as a cripple instead of a corpse." The progress bar ticked to 74%. Sandra leaned against the terminal, holding her bleeding shoulder, and gave Filippo a look that might have been approval or might have been calculation. With her, it was always hard to tell. That brings us to end. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next one.